Tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. Imagine yourself stepping through the heavy curtain that separates the outer courtyard from the inner sanctuary of a Sumerian temple, somewhere in the region we now call southern Iraq. Though when this story begins, Iraq doesn't exist, Sumer doesn't exist, and honestly, the very concept of place, as we understand it, remains negotiable at best. The air inside this temple hangs thick with the smoke of burning cedar and myrrh, expensive imports that traveled hundreds of miles to be consumed in honor of gods whose names you're about to learn, assuming you can stay awake long enough, which, given the purpose of this video, you probably won't, and that's absolutely fine. That's actually the plan, so let's embrace the contradiction together. The floor beneath your feet consists of packed earth covered with woven reed mats, and as you walk deeper into the temple's interior, you notice the walls rising around you, made of mud brick that still holds the fingerprints of the workers who shaped each brick by hand, pressing wet clay into wooden molds under a sun so fierce it could crack the earth itself. The priests here, dressed in woolen robes that must be unbearably hot in Mesopotamia's summer, move with the practiced grace of people who've performed these rituals so many times that the movements have become automatic, muscle memory synchronized with cosmic memory, their hands tracing patterns in the air that mirror patterns they believe exist in the heavens, and if you watch them long enough, you might start to believe it too, or you might just fall asleep, which is totally acceptable. Before we go deeper into the temple, before we encounter the creation myths that these priests preserve in their oral traditions and cuneiform tablets, before we meet the gods with unpronounceable names who will shape reality out of nothing, I need to make something absolutely clear, and I need you to understand that I'm being completely serious when I say this, even though my tone might suggest otherwise. So here it is, the truth, the honest assessment of what you're attempting right now. You probably won't survive this. By survive, I obviously mean stay conscious until the end, because this video is specifically designed to make you drowsy, to ease you into sleep with the steady rhythm of ancient cosmology and the gentle sarcasm of a narrator who's read far too many academic papers about Sumerian mythology and needs to process that information somehow, and this is how I've chosen to process it. By whispering about creation myths to strangers on the internet at whatever hour you're currently experiencing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not interested in guilt-tripping anyone into clicking buttons. I'm interested in creating a small community of people who find something soothing in the combination of ancient history, gentle humor, and the kind of narrative pacing that makes paint drying look like an action sequence. And if that describes you, welcome, you're home, you've found your people, we're all weird here together. Now then, I'm curious, genuinely curious, about where you are right now, both geographically and temporally, because the internet collapses distance in such strange ways that you could be listening to this in Tokyo at dawn, in London at midnight, in Sao Paulo during your lunch break, in Mumbai while stuck in traffic, and all of those moments exist simultaneously in the strange quantum space of uploaded content. So if you feel like it, if you're not already drifting off, leave a comment telling me where you are and what time it is, because I find something deeply comforting in the idea that these ancient Sumerian stories, which once traveled only as far as a clay tablet could be carried by donkey or boat, now circle the globe at the speed of light, reaching people in places the Sumerians never imagined existed, reaching you, right now, in your particular corner of space and time. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The priests in this temple, the one we're imaginatively standing in, preserve stories that predate writing itself, stories that existed first as oral traditions, passed from generation to generation of religious specialists who memorized vast quantities of mythological narrative with accuracy that would shame most modern students, and eventually, when writing developed in Sumer around 3200 BCE, some of these stories were committed to clay tablets in the wedge-shaped script we call cuneiform, and some of those tablets survived, buried in the ruins of ancient cities, waiting thousands of years for archaeologists to dig them up and scholars to painstakingly decode them, and now here we are, you and I, benefiting from that entire chain of preservation and translation, which is either a miracle or a coincidence. depending on your philosophical inclinations. The earliest Sumerian creation myths don't give us a dramatic opening like, in the beginning. Instead, they give us something stranger, something harder to grasp. They give us Namu, whose name means something like the primordial sea or the sea that gave birth. And Namu exists before anything else exists, before the gods, before heaven and earth, before light and darkness, and all the other binary oppositions that structure reality as we know it. Namu is the waters, undifferentiated waters. Waters that contain all possibility but haven't yet actualized any of it. Waters that are simultaneously nowhere and everywhere because where hasn't been invented yet. And if this sounds confusing, well, welcome to cosmogony, where nothing makes sense because we're dealing with the origin of the categories we use to make sense of things. It's turtles all the way down, or rather, it's water all the way down. Primordial water, eternal water, water that dreams of becoming everything. The Sumerians, practical people in many ways, people who invented writing to keep track of grain inventories and property disputes, nevertheless maintained this deeply poetic vision of cosmic origins, and there's something touching about that, something worth pausing over, even as you feel your eyelids growing heavier. They could have said, in the beginning there was dirt and then more dirt, which would have been very Mesopotamian of them, given that their entire civilization was built on dirt, on the alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, but instead they said, in the beginning there was water, which suggests they understood something profound about fluidity, about potential, about the way reality emerges from possibility, like our island emerging from the sea, slowly, gradually, continuously. Mainstream historians and mythologists generally agree that Namu represents the first principle in Sumerian cosmology, the primordial mother from whom the first generation of gods emerges, though the exact mechanisms of this emergence remain debated, and the texts don't always help because ancient scribes apparently assumed their readers already knew the basic story and didn't need every detail spelled out, which is frustrating for modern scholars but perhaps wise in its own way, leaving space for mystery, leaving space for imagination, leaving space for sleep to creep in around the edges of the narrative. Here's where things get interesting, or at least as interesting as they can get when we're discussing the murky origins of Bronze Age theology. Some fringe theorists, and by fringe I mean people who've published books but not necessarily in peer-reviewed journals, suggest that Namu isn't merely a metaphorical representation of primordial waters, but rather a description of some kind of quantum field or pre-material state. And before you dismiss this as modern people projecting contemporary physics onto ancient mythology, which it probably is, consider that the Sumerians were describing something genuinely strange, a state of existence before existence, and we don't actually have adequate language for that. We've never had adequate language for that. So maybe primordial sea works just as well as quantum field, or at least it's more poetic, and poetry might be the appropriate register for discussing the fundamentally indescribable. These theorists point out that water in Sumerian thought possesses creative potential, the ability to give rise to all forms, and they note parallels with modern physics concepts like quantum superposition, where particles exist in multiple states simultaneously until observation collapses them into a specific state. And sure, that's a stretch, that's probably taking the metaphor too literally, but it's the kind of stretch that makes for entertaining late-night reading, and since we're engaged in late-night listening, it seems appropriate to mention. The scholarly debate around Namu centers largely on textual interpretation and the relationship between different Sumerian creation accounts, because here's a fun fact that will either fascinate you or put you to sleep, probably both. The Sumerians didn't have one unified creation myth. They had several, and these myths don't always agree with each other, which bothers modern systematizers far more than it apparently bothered the Sumerians. Some texts emphasize Namu as the first principle, others begin with An, the heaven god, and Ki, the earth goddess, already in existence, and still others start with Enki and Ninhursag engaged in various creative and procreative activities on the island of Dilmun. Scholars like Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent his career translating Sumerian texts and making them accessible to English readers, argued for Namu's primacy based on certain liturgical texts and the etymology of divine names, while other scholars, equally credentialed and equally serious, suggest that different city-states in Sumer had different cosmological traditions, and we shouldn't expect perfect consistency across a civilization that spanned multiple cities and several centuries. This might seem like academic hair-splitting, and in some ways it is, but it's also a reminder that ancient people were perfectly capable of holding multiple contradictory ideas simultaneously without experiencing cognitive dissonance, a skill we might do well to recover, especially when trying to fall asleep while thinking about creation myths. The temple we're standing in, by the way, would have housed a statue of the local patron deity, probably Enlil or Enki depending on which city we're imagining, and this statue wasn't merely symbolic, at least not in the way we think of symbols. It was understood to be the actual dwelling place of the god, the physical location where divine presence manifested most strongly, and priests would care for this statue the way you might care for a living being, dressing it, feeding it, offerings of bread and beer and meat, washing it, putting it to bed at night and waking it in the morning. And if you're thinking this sounds absurd, consider how we treat our smartphones, the rituals of charging and updating and protecting them from harm. And maybe we're not so different from the Sumerians after all. Maybe we've just updated our pantheon. The walls of the temple would have been decorated with scenes from mythology, painted or carved in relief, showing the gods in their characteristic poses and attributes, Enlil with his horned crown indicating divinity, Enki with streams of water flowing from his shoulders, representing his dominion over the sweet groundwater that made agriculture possible, Inanna with her weapons and symbols of fertility because she contains multitudes, she's the goddess of love and war, proving that ancient deities understood complexity better than most modern characters in fiction. Let's return to Namu, floating there in the eternal waters before time begins, and ask a question that the texts don't explicitly answer but which seems obvious to ask. Was she conscious? Did Namu, the primordial sea, experience something like awareness, or was she more like a natural force, operating according to principles but without subjective experience, the way gravity operates without being aware that it's operating? The texts don't say, the priests probably never asked, because that's a very modern question, the kind of question that emerges from Cartesian mind-body dualism and contemporary philosophy of consciousness, and the Sumerians were working from entirely different assumptions about the nature of divinity and matter and the relationship between them. What the texts do tell us, or at least suggest through poetic imagery, is that Namu gave birth to An-Ki, heaven and earth, or alternatively that An-Ki emerged from the primordial waters the way land emerges from sea, gradually through processes of sedimentation and elevation, which is actually a pretty good description of how the Mesopotamian plain itself formed through countless millennia of river deposits building up the land. So maybe the Sumerians were doing geology without realizing it, or maybe I'm doing that thing where I overinterpret ancient texts through the lens of modern knowledge, which is almost certainly what I'm doing, but we've already established that falling asleep requires a certain suspension of critical judgment. So let's continue. An-Ki, heaven and earth, emerge from Namu as a unified entity, still joined together, not yet separated into the distinct cosmic zones that will eventually house gods and humans respectively. And in this primordial state, heaven and earth exist in a kind of cosmic embrace, locked together in the darkness. Because light doesn't exist yet, nothing exists except the potential for existence, which is a deeply strange concept to contemplate as you lie there in your bed, in your room, surrounded by the accumulated matter of the observable universe, all of which supposedly emerged from something like the state we're describing, whether you call it Namu, or the quantum vacuum, or the singularity before the Big Bang. The names change, but the essential mystery remains. The Sumerians, being practical even in their poetry, understood that creation requires separation, differentiation, the establishment of boundaries and categories, and this is where Enlil enters the picture. Enlil, whose name means something like Lord Wind or Lord Storm. Enlil, who will become the king of the gods and the administrator of the universe. Enlil, who has excellent organizational skills and zero tolerance for chaos, though we're getting ahead of ourselves because Enlil hasn't been born yet. We're still in the waters, still in the darkness, still in the time before time when anything could happen because nothing has happened yet. The priests chanting in this temple we're imagining, they're reciting these myths in Sumerian, a language isolate unrelated to any other known language family, a language that sounds absolutely nothing like English, and scholars who've attempted to reconstruct its pronunciation based on cuneiform spellings and comparative linguistics can only give us educated guesses about how it actually sounded, which means that the exact phonetic qualities of these myths are lost to us forever. We have the words but not the music, the meaning but not the melody, and there's something melancholy about that, something that should bother us more than it does. But you're probably too drowsy to be properly melancholy about linguistic extinction, which is fine, the melancholy can wait for morning. The rhythm of the chanting would have been important. The priests understood that ritual speech operates differently from ordinary speech. It creates its own time, its own space, its own consciousness, and maybe that's what you're experiencing right now, listening to this narration that circles around its subject without ever quite landing on it, that provides information while simultaneously undermining the authority of that information with jokes and digressions, that seems designed less to inform than to induce a particular state of consciousness, specifically the state that precedes sleep, where the boundaries between waking and dreaming grow permeable, where ancient Sumerian gods and contemporary bedrooms exist in the same imaginative space. Let me tell you about the tablets themselves, the physical objects that preserved these myths across millennia, because there's something beautiful about clay as a recording medium, something appropriate about using earth to record stories about the creation of earth. Sumerian scribes would take clay, ordinary clay dug from the ground or the riverbank, and they would work it until it reached the right consistency, not too wet, not too dry, just plastic enough to receive impressions, and then they would shape it into tablets, sometimes small enough to hold in one hand, sometimes large enough to require both hands and considerable strength to manipulate, and while the clay was still damp, they would press a reed stylus into its surface, making wedge-shaped marks that combined into signs that represented syllables and words and ideas, and then they would let the tablet dry in the sun or bake it in a kiln, transforming soft clay into hard ceramic, transforming temporary marks into permanent record, or at least as permanent as anything human-made can be. These tablets could survive fire, water, burial, millennia of neglect. They could survive everything except deliberate destruction or accidental crushing, and many of them did survive, tens of thousands of them, dug up from the ruins of ancient libraries and temples and palaces, covered in the very same wedge-shaped script that recorded grain deliveries and royal propaganda, and occasionally the stories of how the world began. The mainstream scholarly consensus, built from decades of careful textual analysis and comparative mythology, holds that Namu represents the Sumerian attempt to conceptualize absolute beginning, the state prior to all states, and that her characterization as water reflects both the literal importance of water to Mesopotamian civilization and the metaphorical appropriateness of water as a symbol for the undifferentiated source of all things. Rivers made Sumer possible, the Tigris and Euphrates bringing water and silt from the mountains to the north, creating the fertile plain where agriculture could flourish, where cities could emerge, where civilization could develop. So of course water plays a central role in cosmic mythology. Of course the source of physical life becomes a template for understanding the source of all existence. This isn't exotic or mysterious, it's human beings doing what human beings do, taking their immediate experience and scaling it up to cosmic proportions, finding patterns in the local environment and projecting those patterns onto the structure of reality itself, which sounds reductive when I put it that way, but it's actually quite profound, this human capacity to move between the particular and the universal, the concrete and the abstract, the puddle and the ocean. Now here's a quirky interpretation that's going to sound absolutely wild, but which some people take seriously, and I'm including it not because I necessarily endorse it, but because sleep comes easier when we entertain strange possibilities without immediately judging them. There's a subset of alternative historians who look at Namu and the Sumerian pantheon generally and suggest that these weren't gods in the supernatural sense but rather advanced beings, possibly extraterrestrial. possibly from a previous terrestrial civilization that predates known history, and these beings engaged in genetic engineering to create or modify early humans, and the primordial waters of Namu represent some kind of primal genetic material or biological substrate from which these beings crafted life. This theory, often associated with writers like Zechariah Sitchin, takes Sumerian mythology extremely literally while simultaneously refusing to take it on its own terms, interpreting gods as astronauts and creation as genetic manipulation, and mainstream scholars absolutely hate this interpretation. They despise it with a passion usually reserved for academic rivals or badly brewed coffee, because it misrepresents the texts, ignores the cultural context, and imports modern concepts anachronistically into ancient material. But, and here's the thing, it's a very popular interpretation outside academia. Millions of people find it compelling, and while I'm not here to adjudicate between mainstream scholarship and fringe theories, I am here to help you fall asleep, and sometimes entertaining wild ideas can be deeply relaxing, especially when you don't have to commit to believing them. You can just let them drift through your consciousness like clouds, interesting shapes that don't require analysis or acceptance, just observation. The scholarly debates around Namu extend beyond mere textual interpretation into questions of religious development and cultural diffusion, because Namu doesn't appear in all periods of Sumerian history with equal prominence. Some eras emphasize her more than others, and scholars argue about whether this reflects changing theological priorities, the influence of different city-states' traditions on the overall Sumerian canon, or simply the accidents of textual preservation. Because we don't have anything like a complete record of Sumerian religious literature, we have fragments, we have pieces, we have the tablets that happen to survive, and we're making inferences from an incomplete data set, which is basically the human condition. We're always working with incomplete information. Whether we're reconstructing ancient cosmology or deciding what to have for breakfast, the methodology doesn't change that much. Some scholars, particularly those working in the tradition of Thorkild Jacobsen, emphasize the evolution of Mesopotamian religious thought from earlier, more animistic conceptions toward later, more anthropomorphic deities, and in this framework, Namu might represent an older stratum of belief, a more abstract principle that was later personified and integrated into a more elaborate mythological system. Other scholars push back against this evolutionary model, arguing that ancient people were perfectly capable of sophisticated abstract thought and that we shouldn't assume their religious concepts developed in a linear progression from primitive to advanced, which is a debate that probably matters more to specialists than to people trying to fall asleep. But I include it because academic controversy has a strangely soporific quality, the gentle back and forth of scholars disagreeing in footnotes and journal articles, the careful parsing of evidence, the measured deployment of counter-arguments. It's like a very slow, very intellectual lullaby. The water that Namu represents, or embodies or is, depending on how literally we want to take the mythology, this water exists in eternal darkness, because light requires the sun, and the sun doesn't exist yet, won't exist until later in the creation sequence, when the great gods organize the cosmos and assign roles to the celestial bodies. So picture absolute darkness, not the darkness of a room at night when your eyes can adjust and make out shapes, but absolute darkness, the complete absence of light, the darkness of a universe before stars, and in this darkness, the water moves or doesn't move, flows or remains still. We don't know because the texts don't specify. They give us the image but not the animation, the noun but not the verb, which means we have to imagine it ourselves, and whatever you're imagining right now is as valid as anything I might suggest. Your primordial ocean is as real as mine, which is to say neither is real at all, they're both imaginative. Constructs built from ancient metaphors filtered through modern translations presented by a narrator who's probably pronouncing all the Sumerian names wrong despite trying very hard to get them right. The theological implications of beginning with water rather than, say, earth or fire or void. These implications have been discussed at great length by historians of religion who note that different cultures choose different primordial elements. The Greeks gave us chaos, the Hebrews gave us formless void over the deep, The Norse gave us the gap between fire and ice, and the Sumerians gave us Namu, salt water and sweet water, ocean and river, the waters that surround and the waters that nourish, all existing before the distinction between surrounding and nourishing could be made. You're still here, or at least your body is still here while your mind starts to wander, starts to drift, starts to float in its own kind of primordial waters, the waters of consciousness ebbing towards sleep. And that's exactly right. That's the goal. We're not trying to stay alert and engaged. We're trying to release alertness, to let engagement fade into something gentler and more diffuse. We're trying to return to an earlier state, not as early as Namu perhaps, but earlier than your current stress and worry and late-night anxiety about tomorrow's responsibilities, earlier than adult consciousness with all its categories and distinctions, back to something simpler, something more fluid, something that doesn't require understanding, only experiencing, only being. The priests in their temple would have understood this. They knew that ritual creates an altered state, that repetition and rhythm and sacred space can shift consciousness, can open doors to different ways of experiencing reality, and while we're not performing a religious ritual exactly, we're doing something adjacent to it. We're using narrative and voice and pacing to create a space where transformation becomes possible, where wakefulness transforms into sleep, where your 21st century bedroom becomes a Sumerian temple, becomes the primordial waters before creation, all at once, all in the same eternal present tense that mythology inhabits. Namu, the primordial sea, dreams perhaps, or if not dreams, then holds within herself all possible dreams, all possible configurations of matter and energy and consciousness, and from this infinite possibility, specificity will emerge, the first gods will take shape, heaven and earth will separate, the world as we know it will begin its long, slow process of becoming actual rather than merely potential. But we're not there yet. We're still floating in the before time, still suspended in the waters that have no shore because shores haven't been invented yet, still existing in the moment before the moment when everything changes, and you can stay here as long as you need to. Stay here in the darkness and the water and the possibility. Stay here until sleep takes you, until you drift from this ancient temple into your own dreams, carrying with you perhaps some fragment of Sumerian cosmology, some image of primordial waters, some sense of the human need to explain beginnings even. When beginnings are inherently inexplicable, some comfort in the knowledge that people have been telling each other creation stories since the invention of storytelling, trying to make sense of existence, trying to find meaning in the chaos, trying to sleep. The darkness we left you floating in at the end of the last section, that primordial darkness of Namu's waters, cannot last forever, though forever is a tricky concept when we're discussing a time before time, when we're operating in the mythological past that exists outside linear chronology. But let's not get too tangled in temporal paradoxes, because that's the kind of thinking that prevents sleep rather than inducing it. So let's just say that change comes to the unchanging waters, movement comes to the stillness, separation comes to the unified whole, and this separation arrives in the form of Enlil, whose birth or emergence or sudden existence we need to discuss now, though the exact mechanisms remain, as so much in Sumerian mythology remains, frustratingly vague. Enlil, whose name we can translate roughly as Lord Wind or Lord Air, or possibly Lord Storm, though these translations don't quite capture the full semantic range of the Sumerian terms. Enlil emerges as the child of An and Ki, heaven and earth, who themselves emerged from Namu, which means we're now into the second generation of deities, and divine genealogy functions differently from human genealogy. Gods can exist before their parents exist, can give birth to themselves, can be both created and uncreated, depending on which text you're reading. So don't worry too much about the logical inconsistencies, just let the story wash over you like water, like the primordial water we just left, flowing around obstacles rather than trying to push through them. An, the sky god, and Kai, the earth goddess, exist initially as a unified cosmic entity, locked together in what the texts describe as a kind of primordial mountain, the mountain of heaven and earth, which is a strange image when you think about it. A mountain that is somehow both the ceiling of the world and its floor, both above and below, both masculine and feminine, both everything and nothing, and this unified state cannot sustain itself, cannot persist, because the nature of reality as we experience it requires differentiation, requires up and down, here and there, self and other, and so separation becomes necessary, becomes inevitable, and Enlil, newly existent, newly powerful, armed with divine authority and possibly actual weapons. Though the texts differ on this point, Enlil forcibly separates his parents, pushes the sky up and the earth down, creating space between them, creating the world as we know it, creating room for everything that will follow, including us, including you, lying there in your bed, existing in the space that Enlil supposedly created when he split the cosmic mountain. This is the Sumerian version of creation as separation. Creation as the establishment of boundaries and categories, and it's actually a pretty common motif in world mythology. You see it in the Greek myth of Uranos and Gaia. You see it in the Egyptian myth of Geb and Nut. You see it across cultures because apparently human beings, looking at the sky above and the earth below, naturally wonder how they got separated, naturally create stories to explain the gap, and the Sumerians created this story, this image of Enlil forcing apart his parents, which is either cosmically profound or deeply weird depending on how you look at it, possibly both. The mainstream scholarly understanding of this separation myth, built from textual analysis and comparative religious studies, interprets Enlil's action as representing the necessary organization of chaos into cosmos, the imposition of order onto formless potential, and scholars note that Enlil becomes the supreme administrator of the universe, the god who assigns roles to other gods, who maintains cosmic law, who ensures that the machinery of reality continues functioning properly, which makes him sound like a celestial bureaucrat, and honestly that's not far off. Enlil is the manager, the organizer, the one who makes sure everyone else is doing their job, and if that sounds less exciting than gods who battle monsters or seduce mortals, well, the Sumerians apparently valued good management. They built their entire civilization on irrigation agriculture, which requires careful coordination and planning. So of course their supreme deity embodies administrative competence rather than martial prowess or sexual charisma. Though to be fair, Enlil has his moments, he's not boring, he's just organized. Samuel Noah Kramer, the great Sumerian scholar whose translations made these myths accessible to English readers, emphasized Enlil's role as the god who pronounces destinies, who speaks things into being, who uses divine utterance to establish the fundamental laws of reality. And there's something deeply Sumerian about creation through speech, creation through official pronouncement, because the Sumerians invented writing precisely to make official pronouncements, to record decrees and laws and judgments. So of course their cosmology features a god whose words create reality. It's mythology recapitulating culture, culture recapitulating mythology, the Ouroboros of human meaning, making eating its own tail while you drift off to sleep. Now here's where we get into some delightfully quirky interpretations that mainstream scholars regard with approximately the same enthusiasm they'd have for finding a scorpion in their shoe, but which nevertheless have their adherents and their own strange logic. Some alternative researchers examining the Sumerian texts through a lens that combines ancient astronaut theory with contemporary physics suggest that the separation of heaven and earth doesn't describe a mythological event but rather represents an actual cosmic phenomenon, possibly the moment when a rogue planet or large celestial body passed through the early solar system, disrupting the formation of planets and creating the asteroid belt. Or alternatively, and this is where things get really wild, the separation represents the splitting of dimensions, the differentiation of a unified quantum field into discrete planes of existence, with heaven representing a higher dimensional reality and earth representing our familiar three-dimensional space, and Enlil represents some kind of dimensional engineering technology or entity that facilitated this split. This interpretation requires you to read Sumerian mythology as encoded scientific knowledge, preserved by an advanced civilization that understood physics at a level we're only now beginning to approach, and while this is almost certainly not what the Sumerian priests who composed these texts had in mind, it's the kind of interpretation that's fascinating at 2 in the morning when your critical faculties have gone to sleep, even if you haven't, when the boundary between plausible and implausible becomes as blurry as the boundary between waking and dreaming, and honestly, whether Enlil is a god or an alien or a personified natural force or a metaphor for human consciousness organizing sensory chaos into meaningful categories, the story still works, the image of separation still resonates, the mythology still does its job of making you think about beginnings and endings and the structure of reality until you stop thinking at all and just sleep. The scholarly debates around this separation myth focus partly on textual variations and partly on broader questions of mythological interpretation and development, because we have multiple versions of this story and they don't always agree on the details. Some texts give Enlil the credit for separation, others attribute it to different deities or describe it as a more collaborative effort, and scholars have spent considerable time and energy trying to establish which version is original or authentic, which is a somewhat odd endeavor given that oral traditions don't really have originals, they have versions, they have performances, they have iterations, and each telling is simultaneously the same story and a different story, but academic culture values establishing definitive texts and authoritative interpretations. So the debate continues, probably will continue long after all of us are dead, which is oddly comforting, the idea that scholars centuries from now will still be arguing about Sumerian mythology, still trying to understand what these ancient people meant when they described their gods and their cosmos, still engaged in the very human project of trying to recover meaning from fragmentary evidence and partial understanding. Thorkild Jacobson, another major figure in Sumerian studies, suggested that the separation myth reflects Mesopotamian environmental reality, specifically the experience of living in a flat alluvial plain where the earth seems to stretch to the horizon in all directions, and the sky appears as a vast dome overhead, and the creation of space between earth and sky mirrors the human experience of space in that particular geographical setting, which is a materialist interpretation, grounding mythology in physical environment, and it's probably at least partly correct, though it doesn't fully explain the emotional power of the myth, doesn't account for why this image of separation continues to resonate across cultures and millennia. Why you, lying in your bed in whatever century you're listening to this, can still connect with the essential truth the myth is trying to convey, that reality as we know it requires separation, requires distinction, requires the painful but necessary act of differentiation. When Enlil forces apart heaven and earth, he creates violence, creates trauma, creates the first wound in the fabric of existence, because separation is always violent, always involves tearing apart what was unified, breaking what was whole, and this violence, this necessary violence, echoes through all subsequent creation, through the birth of each new thing that requires separation from its source, through every individual consciousness that must differentiate itself from its environment, through your own birth, when you separated from your mother's body and became a distinct organism, through every morning when you separate from sleep and return to waking consciousness. The pattern repeats, the wound reopens, the separation happens again and again, because that's what it means to exist, to be a separate thing in a world of separate things, and maybe that's exhausting. Maybe that's why sleep feels so good, because in sleep the boundaries soften, the separation becomes less absolute. You float back towards some earlier state where you're not quite so distinct, not quite so alone, not quite so separate from everything else. You drift back toward the unified mountain before Enlil split it apart, and there's comfort in that. There's peace in that temporary dissolution of boundaries, so let it happen. Let the separation reverse itself for a few hours. Let yourself merge with the darkness and the silence and the soft rhythm of your own breathing. The temple priests, chanting these myths in their ancient language, understood that words create reality, but also that reality exceeds words, that no description can fully capture the thing described, that all mythology points toward truths that can't be fully articulated, only suggested, only approached asymptotically. And maybe that's why these stories persist. why they continue to move us even when we don't believe in the literal existence of Enlil or An or Ki or any of the other gods populating the Sumerian pantheon, because the stories aren't really about whether gods exist, they're about how we exist, how consciousness emerges from matter, how order arises from chaos, how meaning crystallizes from meaninglessness, how you, specifically you, find yourself here in this particular moment, listening to a voice describe ancient myths in the hope that the description will somehow ease you into sleep, and the fact that this might actually work, that listening to someone talk about Sumerian cosmology could genuinely help you fall asleep, is its own kind of magic, its own kind of mythology, the story we tell ourselves about what stories can do, about how narrative shapes consciousness, about why human beings seem constitutionally unable to experience reality without immediately turning it into stories, without creating mythologies and cosmologies and elaborate explanatory frameworks that may or may not correspond to objective truth but which definitely correspond to subjective need, the need to understand, the need to create meaning, the need to sleep. After the separation, after Enlil establishes the space between heaven and earth, this space becomes the realm of air, of wind, of breath, of Lil, which is Enlil's element, his domain, his essential nature, and this makes sense symbolically because air is what allows communication. Sound waves travel through air. Your voice right now, the voice you're hearing in your head as you read or listen to these words, exists because of air, because of vibration traveling through gaseous medium, because Enlil, in forcing apart his parents, created the space for speech, for song, for language, for all the things that make us human, which means we owe our entire linguistic and cultural inheritance to an act of cosmic violence, to a god forcibly separating his parents, which is either profound or disturbing or both, and I'm going to go with both. I'm going to hold both interpretations simultaneously, because that's what mythology allows, that's what mythology demands, the ability to contain contradictions, to accept paradox, to acknowledge that creation and destruction are two faces of the same cosmic process, that every beginning is also an ending, that every birth involves a death, that Enlil's great achievement and his great crime are the same act, viewed from different angles, interpreted through different frameworks, and the truth, if there is a truth, exists somewhere in the space between the interpretations, in the air between heaven and earth, in the breath between your lungs and the world, in the pause between this sentence and the next. Now let's talk about the real estate that results from this cosmic separation, because once you have heaven up there and earth down here and air in between, you have different zones, different territories that need to be assigned and managed and inhabited, and this is where the Sumerian cosmology gets delightfully specific, almost bureaucratic in its attention to detail, because the Sumerians didn't just imagine gods vaguely floating around in cosmic space, they imagined gods with specific jobs, specific territories, specific responsibilities, and they created an elaborate divine hierarchy that mirrors human social organization, which tells us as much about Sumerian society as it does about Sumerian theology. An, the sky god, gets the heavens as his domain, which makes sense. His name means heaven, he is heaven, or heaven is him. The boundary between God and thing governed by God remains permeable in Sumerian thought, and rules from his celestial palace, largely distant from human affairs, a remote sovereign who sets overall policy but delegates actual administration to others, specifically to Enlil, who gets the Earth's surface, the realm of air, the space where humans will eventually live, and Enlil becomes the executive deity, the one who actually runs things, who makes decisions, who maintains order, while Enki, the god of fresh water and wisdom, gets the Abzu, the underground ocean of sweet water that feeds springs and rivers and becomes the clever god, the trickster god, the god of knowledge and magic and all the arts of civilization. So already we have a three-part cosmic structure, heaven above, Earth's surface in the middle, underground waters below, and this structure will determine everything that follows, all subsequent mythology, all cosmic organization, all the stories about gods and humans interacting across these different zones. Agriculture, who live in entirely different environments with entirely different technologies, can still find meaning in stories about gods dividing up cosmic territory, can still connect with the essential pattern the mythology expresses, which is the pattern of differentiation, of specialization, of the division of labor that makes complex society possible, whether that society is divine or human, ancient or modern, Sumerian or contemporary. Here's a quirky interpretation that's going to make academic mythologists sigh deeply, but which has a certain internal logic if you approach it with an open mind, or at least a drowsy mind, because drowsiness makes everything seem more plausible. Some alternative researchers suggest that the three-part cosmic division in Sumerian mythology doesn't represent a vertical arrangement, heaven-earth underworld, but rather a horizontal one, three different locations on or near Earth's surface, with An ruling a northern region, Enlil ruling Mesopotamia itself, and Enki ruling a southern region, possibly the area around the Persian Gulf or even further south. And these weren't gods but rather rulers or leaders of different early civilizations, and the mythology preserves historical memory of ancient geopolitical arrangements, with divine names substituting for actual political entities in a process of mythologization that occurred over centuries of oral transmission. This interpretation requires you to euhemerize the gods, to see them as deified humans rather than purely supernatural beings. And while euhemerist interpretation has a long and mostly discredited history in mythological studies, it occasionally captures something real, occasionally points to actual historical events or persons embedded in mythological narrative, though usually in ways far more complex and ambiguous than straightforward one-to-one correlation. And in any case, whether the Sumerian gods were gods or kings or personified natural forces or collective representations of social groups or some combination of all these things, the mythology still functions, still creates meaning, still helps people understand their place in a complex and often overwhelming universe, still helps you fall asleep here in the 21st century. So maybe the question of what they really were is less important than the question of what they mean, what they do, how they function in human consciousness and culture. The scholarly debates around the division of the cosmos touch on larger questions about the relationship between mythology and social structure, with some scholars emphasizing the ways religious ideology justifies and naturalizes social hierarchy, showing how the divine hierarchy of Sumerian mythology mirrors and reinforces human hierarchy, with An as remote king, Enlil as active administrator, and Enki as clever advisor, mapping onto actual social roles in Sumerian city-states, while other scholars push back against this functionalist interpretation, arguing that mythology doesn't simply reflect social structure but actively shapes it, provides models for human organization, gives people imaginative resources for thinking about authority and power and justice, and the truth probably lies somewhere between these positions. Mythology both reflects and shapes, both describes and prescribes, both mirrors reality and imagines alternatives to reality, and the relationship between myth and society is dialectical, mutually constituting, constantly evolving, which is the kind of nuanced scholarly position that's absolutely correct but also somewhat unsatisfying, because humans, especially drowsy humans, prefer simple stories to complex analyses, prefer clear answers to dialectical relationships, prefer to know definitively whether gods are real or metaphorical, whether myths are true or false, whether the universe actually has the structure Sumerian cosmology describes, or whether we're just making patterns where none exist. And I can't give you those definitive answers. Nobody can. The questions are too big, the evidence too fragmentary, the conceptual frameworks too culturally bound. So maybe just let the uncertainty wash over you. Let it be okay not to know. Let yourself exist in the space between heaven and earth, between sleeping and waking, between ancient Mesopotamia and your contemporary bedroom, between all the various poles and boundaries and categories that structure our existence. The space that Enlil creates, the air between heaven and earth, becomes the realm of possibility, the domain where things happen, where change occurs, where time begins to flow in something like the linear direction we experience it, because in Namu's waters, in the unified mountain of Anki, there's no time, or time exists differently, circularly, eternally, but once separation occurs, once you have distinct locations and the possibility of movement between them, you have the preconditions for narrative, for causality, for the unfolding of events in sequence, and this is when the Sumerian cosmology really gets going, when the machinery of creation kicks into higher gear, when the gods start creating things and organizing things and making the elaborate world that will eventually include cities and agriculture and writing and all the other achievements of Sumerian civilization, but also the world that will include suffering and labor and death. Because Enlil's separation, necessary as it is, comes with costs, creates problems that subsequent myths will attempt to address or resolve or at least acknowledge, and maybe that's the most profound thing the Sumerian creation myths give us, the recognition that creation is always ambiguous, always includes both gifts and curses, always involves trade-offs, that there's no perfect beginning, no pure origin, only the messy, complicated, contradictory process by which something emerges from nothing, by which cosmos arises from chaos, by which you, every morning, separate from sleep and return to the waking world, carrying the memory of that earlier undifferentiated state, that primordial unity as a kind of promise or threat, the possibility that you could return to it, could dissolve back into the waters, could release the boundaries that make you you, and while that might sound frightening in the harsh light of day, here in the gentle darkness of approaching sleep, it might sound more like comfort, more like relief, more like permission to let go. The priests in the temple, having chanted the myths of separation, would now move on to the next phase of the liturgy, the next section of the cosmic narrative. But we're going to pause here. We're going to let the image settle, the image of heaven and earth forced apart, the image of space opening between them, the image of Enlil standing in that space he's created, surveying the cosmos he's organized, preparing for the next phase of creation, which will involve more gods and more distinctions and more complicated relationships. But that's for later, that's for the next section. Right now you need to breathe, need to feel the air that Enlil supposedly created moving in and out of your lungs, need to recognize that every breath is a kind of miracle, a kind of magic, a kind of mythology made flesh, made real, made present in your body in this moment, and whether the gods are real or imaginary or something in between, whether the myths are literal or metaphorical or some strange combination of both, you're breathing, you're here, you're existing in the space between heaven and earth, in the realm of air and possibility, in the domain that Enlil rules, and that's enough, that's more than enough, that's everything. So breathe, just breathe, let the air flow, let the boundaries soften, let the separation that creates your individual consciousness begin to dissolve into the undifferentiated space of sleep. Let Enlil's great achievement reverse itself just for tonight, just for these hours of darkness. Let heaven and earth come back together, let the cosmic mountain reform, let yourself return to the waters before time, and rest, finally rest. The gods, having established their cosmic domains and sorted out the basic structure of reality, heaven above and earth below, and the various waters in between and around, now face a problem that probably should have been obvious from the start, but which apparently required several divine generations to fully recognize, and the problem is this: maintaining a cosmos is hard work. Running the universe requires labor, constant labor, unending labor. Someone has to make sure the rivers keep flowing and the seasons keep cycling and the celestial bodies maintain their appointed courses, and the gods, being powerful immortal beings with divine dignity and cosmic authority, really don't want to do this work themselves, which is very relatable, honestly, very human. The desire to avoid tedious necessary labor, the wish to delegate unpleasant tasks to someone else, anyone else, and so the gods, in their wisdom or selfishness or practical necessity, decide they need workers. Servants, subordinates who can handle the day-to-day maintenance of reality, while the gods focus on more important divine matters like, I don't know, attending celestial banquets and making long-term strategic decisions and engaging in the various romantic and political intrigues that seem to occupy so much of divine time in most mythological systems. This is where we enter what's probably the most famous Sumerian creation myth, the myth of how humanity came to exist. And spoiler alert, it's not a particularly flattering origin story. We weren't created because the gods loved us, or wanted companions, or had some noble purpose in mind. We were created because the gods needed laborers, needed someone to dig irrigation canals and plant crops and build temples and perform all the various tasks that civilization requires. We're essentially cosmic servants, divine employees, created for a job, which is either deeply depressing or darkly hilarious depending on your mood and how much sleep you've gotten recently. And given that you're listening to this, probably not enough sleep. So let's go with hilarious. Let's find the comedy in being cosmically employed by deities who view us primarily as a workforce. The earliest myths about human creation describe a time when the lesser gods, the Igigi, were doing all the work, and they were unhappy about it, understandably, divinely unhappy, which is probably much worse than regular human unhappiness because gods can hold grudges for eons and have access to cosmic powers with which to express their dissatisfaction. And according to the Atrahasis epic, which preserves one version of this creation story, the Igigi gods eventually rebelled. They went on strike. They surrounded Enlil's house in Nipper and demanded better working conditions, which makes this possibly the first labor dispute in recorded mythology, and I appreciate the Sumerians for this, for imagining that even divine labor has its limits, that even gods can be exploited, that cosmic capitalism requires the same kind of negotiation and conflict that terrestrial capitalism does, though the resolution is different. Instead of better wages or shorter hours, the great gods decide to create an entirely new class of workers, not gods but not quite not gods either, something in between, something that can do the necessary work without having the divine status that would make exploitation problematic. And thus humanity is conceived, not in love but in labor relations, not from spiritual aspiration but from economic necessity. And while this might not be the creation story you learned in Sunday school, it has its own brutal honesty, its own recognition of the role that labor and coercion play in the structure of civilization, divine or otherwise. The actual mechanism of human creation varies across different Sumerian and Akkadian texts, but the most common version involves Enki, the wise god of fresh water and magic and all clever arts, working together with a mother goddess, sometimes called Ninhursag, sometimes Ninmah, sometimes Nintu. The names shift, but the role remains consistent. She's the goddess who shapes living things, who has special power over birth and creation and the mysteries of biological generation, and together Enki and the mother goddess devise a plan to create humans from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, usually a god who participated in the rebellion, or at least a god who can be sacrificed for this purpose. And the symbolism here is thick, rich, layered, clay representing earth, materiality, the malleable substance from which physical forms can be shaped, and divine blood representing spirit, consciousness, the animating principle that makes mere matter into living being. So humans are literally composed of earth and divinity. We're mud animated by stolen or donated or sacrificed divine essence. We're the cosmic compromise between pure matter and pure spirit, existing in that ambiguous space between, which explains a lot about the human condition actually, explains why we're capable of both sublime thought and base action, why we can contemplate eternity and also forget where we put our keys, why consciousness feels simultaneously transcendent and hopelessly embedded in flesh. We're clay and godblood. We're both. We're the mixture, and maybe that's why we're so confused all the time, so conflicted, so prone to existential anxiety, because our very substance is contradictory. Our essence is combination. We're trying to reconcile incompatible elements every moment of our existence, and it's exhausting, which is why sleep feels so necessary, so restorative. It's the time when the contradiction can rest, when the clay can stop trying to remember it has divine blood, when the divine blood can stop being disappointed that it's stuck in clay. Mainstream scholarly interpretation of the human creation myths focuses on their social and theological implications. Scholars note that these myths justify the social order of ancient Mesopotamia, where the vast majority of people were laborers, farmers, servants, working to support a small elite of priests and rulers who claimed special divine authority. The myths naturalize social hierarchy by suggesting it's built into the cosmic order. Humans exist to serve gods. Some humans exist to serve other humans who represent the gods, and this whole elaborate system is portrayed as necessary, inevitable, written into the very structure of creation, which is pretty effective propaganda when you think about it. pretty clever social engineering, and scholars debate to what extent the Sumerian priesthood consciously designed these myths to support the status quo versus to what extent the myths emerged organically from a society already structured by hierarchy and simply reflected that structure back in mythological form. And as usual, the truth probably combines both processes. Myths both justify and naturalize existing arrangements, and also create imaginative frameworks that shape future arrangements. It's dialectical, mutually constituting, complex, and the fact that we're still telling stories about human origins, still creating narratives to explain where we come from and why we're here and what our purpose might be, suggests that the Sumerian myths touch on something universal, some deep human need to understand our place in the cosmos, to make sense of our existence through narrative, even if that narrative is sometimes uncomfortable or unflattering, or suggests we're basically divine servants created to dig canals. Here's where we venture into truly wild territory, the kind of interpretation that makes academic scholars want to weep or laugh, or possibly both simultaneously, but which has captured the imagination of millions of people who find mainstream archaeology and ancient history somehow unsatisfying, too cautious, too unwilling to consider alternative possibilities. And this interpretation suggests that the Sumerian creation myths preserve actual historical memory of genetic engineering, that when the texts describe Enki mixing clay and divine blood to create humans, they're describing, in the only terms available to ancient people, a process of genetic modification where clay represents the existing hominid species on Earth, possibly Homo erectus, or some other precursor to modern humans, and divine blood represents genetic material from the Anunnaki, who in this interpretation aren't gods, but advanced beings from another planet, possibly Nibiru, a hypothetical planet in our solar system with a long elliptical orbit, and these beings, the Anunnaki, came to Earth to mine gold or extract other resources, needed workers, and so they genetically modified existing terrestrial primates to create Homo sapiens, creating us, and the myths preserve this history in coded form, in mythological language, and we can recover the true history by carefully decoding the metaphors, translating God to extraterrestrial, divine power, to advanced technology, and so on. This interpretation, associated primarily with Zecharia Sitchin and his followers, is almost universally rejected by mainstream scholars who point out numerous problems with the linguistic, archaeological, and astronomical claims it makes, who note that Nibiru doesn't exist as far as we can tell, that there's no evidence of ancient genetic engineering, that the Sumerian texts don't actually say what Sitchin claims they say when you translate them carefully. But despite all this scholarly rejection, the interpretation persists, thrives even, and I include it here not because I endorse it, but because it's genuinely interesting how it repackages ancient mythology in scientific language, how it tries to preserve the essential narrative while updating the explanatory framework, and also because thinking about ancient astronauts is oddly soothing at 2 in the morning. It's the kind of grand cosmic conspiracy that makes ordinary worries seem smaller, less significant, and sometimes that shift in perspective is exactly what you need to relax, to let go, to sleep. The scholarly debates around human creation in Sumerian mythology extend into questions about the relationship between Sumerian and later biblical creation accounts because there are obvious similarities between the Sumerian story of humans created from clay and divine essence and the Genesis story of Adam formed from dust and animated by God's breath. And scholars have extensively discussed whether Genesis depends on earlier Mesopotamian sources, whether there's direct literary influence, whether the similarities reflect common cultural heritage in the ancient Near East, or whether they're coincidental convergent mythological evolution, different cultures independently arriving at similar images and metaphors for addressing the same fundamental questions about human origins and nature. The consensus view is that there probably is some historical relationship, that the biblical authors likely knew Mesopotamian creation traditions and adapted them for monotheistic purposes, transforming the story of gods creating servants into a story of one god creating beloved but flawed creatures, and this transformation is itself interesting, reveals something about the different theological priorities of polytheistic and monotheistic systems, but it also shows continuity, shows that certain images and narratives have remarkable staying power, clay and breath, earth and spirit, material and divine. These combinations keep recurring because they capture something essential about how human consciousness experiences embodiment, experiences the strange fact of being aware, being alive, being somehow more than just matter even though we're definitely made of matter, and the mystery of this, the fundamental weirdness of consciousness emerging from carbon and water and electrical impulses, is no less mysterious now than it was to the ancient Sumerians. We've just swapped their vocabulary for ours, their gods for our neurons, their myths for our theories, but the essential question remains unanswered, remains perhaps unanswerable. And that's okay, that's fine. Some questions exist not to be answered but to be asked, to be contemplated, to provide structure for thought and conversation, and eventually, if we're lucky, sleep. The mother goddess, whether we call her Ninhursag or Ninmah or Nintu or any of her other names and titles, doesn't just mechanically create humans like some kind of divine factory worker. The myths describe her as carefully shaping each human, as a potter shapes clay on a wheel, with skill and attention and what we might call artistry, and she creates not just one template repeated endlessly, but variations. She experiments, she makes different kinds of humans with different characteristics, and some of these experiments don't work out, produce beings who can't function properly, and the myths describe this with surprising frankness, describing disabled or malformed beings who emerge from the creation process. And there's some scholarly debate about what this means, whether it's an attempt to explain human variation and disability, whether it represents actual Sumerian attitudes toward people with disabilities, whether it's metaphorical or literal, and modern readers sometimes find these passages disturbing because they seem to treat disability as divine mistake or failed experiment, but they also show the myths grappling with the reality of human diversity, acknowledging that creation isn't uniform, isn't perfect, produces variety, including variety that makes life difficult. And maybe there's something valuable in this acknowledgement, this refusal to present an idealized vision of humanity, this willingness to include the messy, complicated reality of actual human bodies and minds in the mythological account of our origins. Once created, once shaped from clay and blood and brought to life through whatever magical or technological or divine process the myths describe without fully explaining, humans are assigned their purpose, their function in the cosmic order, and that purpose is work, labor, service. We're supposed to dig canals and plant crops and build temples and offer sacrifices and generally maintain the infrastructure of civilization so that gods can enjoy the benefits without doing the actual tedious labor themselves. And if this sounds exploitative, well, yes, it is. It's absolutely exploitative. It's a myth that describes cosmic exploitation, divine capitalism, heavenly hierarchy, and the Sumerians apparently saw nothing wrong with this. Or at least the priests who composed and preserved these myths saw nothing wrong with it, because it reflected their understanding of how the world worked. Labor was necessary. Someone had to do it. Better that humans do it than gods, and humans should accept this arrangement because it's literally what we were created for. It's our cosmic purpose, our reason for existing. And while modern sensibilities might rebel against this vision of human life as merely instrumental, merely means to divine ends, there's also something strangely honest about it, something that acknowledges the centrality of work in human existence, the way labor shapes our lives and communities and identities, for better or worse. And maybe the myth isn't justifying exploitation so much as describing it, holding up a mirror to the reality of how societies function, how some people work while others benefit from that work, how this arrangement gets naturalized and justified through stories about gods and creation and cosmic purpose, and seeing the mechanism laid bare like this, seeing the mythology do its work of justification and naturalization, maybe that creates the possibility of questioning it, resisting it, imagining alternatives though. That's probably me projecting modern critical consciousness onto ancient myths that didn't intend any such thing, that simply described the world as their creators understood it. The creation of humanity marks a turning point in the Sumerian cosmos, because now there are beings who exist in that intermediate space between pure materiality and pure divinity. beings who can mediate between earth and heaven, between the mundane work of maintaining reality and the divine enjoyment of the results, and humans become the crucial link in the cosmic chain. We're the workers, but also the worshippers. We're the servants, but also the representatives. We speak to gods on behalf of earth, and we implement divine will on earth on behalf of gods, and this double role, this intermediary position, gives humanity a certain importance despite our subordinate status, makes us necessary in ways that transcend mere labor, because gods need worship as much as they need work, need recognition, need relationship, need something, and we provide it. We fill a gap in the cosmic structure that couldn't be filled any other way, which is either comforting or depressing depending on whether you prefer to think of human significance as inherent or functional, as something we possess in ourselves or something we derive from our role in a larger system, and honestly both perspectives have merit, both capture something true about human existence. We're simultaneously insignificant specks on a tiny planet and crucial participants in the grand cosmic drama. We're nothing and everything, meaningless and meaningful, and holding both truths simultaneously is the kind of paradox that mythology handles better than philosophy. Mythology doesn't demand logical consistency, doesn't require you to choose one pole or the other. Mythology lets you be both, lets you exist in the contradiction, and maybe that's why these ancient stories still work, still resonate, still help people make sense of existence and eventually fall asleep, because they accept the fundamental paradoxes of conscious embodied life, accept the contradictions, tell stories that hold multiple truths at once without trying to resolve them into neat, systematic philosophy. The clay from which we're made, that Mesopotamian mud, that alluvial soil deposited by the Tigris and Euphrates over millennia, that's not just metaphorical, it's literal. The Sumerians actually lived in a world made of mud. Their houses were mud brick, their temples were mud brick, their whole civilization was built on mud and reeds and river water. So when they said humans were made of clay, they were saying we're made of the same stuff as everything else in our environment. We're continuous with the material world, we're local, we're of this place, we're Mesopotamian all the way down to our substance, and there's something beautiful about that, something that resists the tendency toward abstract universalism, that insists on the particularity of human existence, the way we're always embedded in specific environments, shaped by specific ecologies, made from the literal soil of specific places, and while we modern people tend to think of ourselves as somehow separate from our environment, as minds that happen to be housed in bodies that happen to exist in places, the Sumerian creation myths offer a different vision, a vision of radical continuity between self and world, between human and earth, between consciousness and clay, and maybe spending some time with that vision, really inhabiting it, really feeling yourself as clay animated by divine breath or electrical impulses or whatever you want to call the animating principle. Maybe that's healing. Maybe that's grounding. Maybe that's exactly what you need right now as you lie there feeling disconnected and anxious and unable to sleep. Maybe you need to remember your clay, your earth. You're the same substance as the planet beneath you, and there's nothing to worry about because clay doesn't worry. Clay just exists. Clay just is. And yes, you're also divine blood. You're also consciousness. You're also the part that asks questions and makes meanings and can't quite accept just being clay. But right now, right here, in this moment approaching sleep, maybe you can let the divine blood quiet down. Maybe you can let the consciousness relax. Maybe you can remember that you're mostly clay, mostly earth, mostly matter, and matter doesn't have anxiety disorders. Matter doesn't lie awake at 3 in the morning worrying about tomorrow. Matter just rests. And you can rest too. You can let the clay part of you take over, can let yourself be heavy and solid and still, can let yourself sink into the mattress like mud settling at the bottom of a riverbed, can let yourself become what you've always been, earth returning to earth, clay recognizing clay, the cosmic worker finally getting some rest. Humanity exists now. We've been created. We've been assigned our cosmic job. We're here on earth with our clay bodies and our divine blood and our purpose of serving the gods through labor, but we're not actually equipped yet to do the work we're supposed to do because being made of the right materials isn't the same as having the necessary knowledge and skills and tools and social organizations required to build irrigation systems and plant crops and construct temples and perform all the other civilized activities that the gods expect from us. So we need civilization, we need culture, we need technology, we need all those distinctly human things that separate us from other animals and make complex society possible. And according to Sumerian mythology, we don't figure these things out ourselves through trial and error and slow accumulation of knowledge over generations. Instead, we receive them as gifts from the gods, specifically from Enki, the clever god of fresh water and wisdom, who apparently takes a special interest in humanity, who seems to like us despite or because of his role in creating us, who becomes humanity's patron and teacher and occasional rescuer from divine punishment. And if there's one god in the Sumerian pantheon who comes close to being humanity's friend, rather than just our employer, it's Enki, which is interesting because he's also the trickster god, the clever one, the one who bends rules and finds loopholes and operates in the gray areas of divine law, suggesting that civilization itself, all those tools and techniques and social structures we think of as progress, might be fundamentally subversive, fundamentally about finding clever solutions to problems, fundamentally about working around natural and social constraints, fundamentally about trickery and negotiation and creative rule-breaking, which honestly makes more sense than the idea that civilization is about following rules. Civilization is about making new rules, better rules, rules that serve human flourishing rather than mere survival, and Enki, bless his trickster heart, helps us do that. The texts describe Enki as the keeper of the me, which is a Sumerian word that doesn't translate easily into English. Scholars usually render it as divine powers, or cosmic principles, or cultural fundamentals, but it encompasses both abstract principles and concrete technologies, both ideals and practical tools, both metaphysical truths and mundane skills. It's everything that makes civilization possible, from kingship to writing to music to warfare to sexual practices, to brewing beer. Yes, brewing beer is one of the me. The Sumerians understood that beer is fundamental to civilization, and honestly they were right. Fermentation technology is crucial to settled agricultural society. It's a way to preserve grain, to make water safer to drink, to create something that makes the hardship of agricultural labor slightly more bearable. So beer belongs in any serious accounting of civilizational fundamentals, and the fact that the Sumerians included it in their list of divine powers suggests they had their priorities straight. They understood what really matters, and I appreciate them for that. I really do. I appreciate any culture that recognizes beer as a cosmic principle rather than just a beverage. That's the kind of theological sophistication that deserves respect. The mainstream scholarly understanding of the me emphasizes their role as organizing principles of Sumerian society. Scholars see them as representing the ideological and material foundations of urban civilization, and the myths about Enki controlling the me and distributing them to humans or sometimes to other gods reflect real social processes of knowledge transmission, technological development, and cultural evolution, though obviously in mythological form. And there's extensive scholarly work on counting and categorizing and interpreting the me, because different texts list different numbers and types of me, sometimes over 100 of them, and scholars debate which ones are most fundamental, which ones represent genuine Sumerian concepts versus later additions or scribal errors, which ones tell us most about Sumerian values and social structure. And it's actually quite fascinating if you're into this sort of thing, reading scholarly arguments about ancient lists of abstract principles and concrete technologies, though I recognize that most people listening to this are more interested in falling asleep than in analyzing cuneiform catalogues of divine powers, so I'll try not to get too deep into the weeds here. I'll try to maintain the gentle narrative flow that induces drowsiness rather than alertness, try to keep things moving along without too much academic detail. Though I make no promises, sometimes the details are irresistible. Sometimes you just have to mention that one of the me is specifically the art of love lovemaking, and another is the destruction of cities, and these are apparently equally important cosmic principles, both necessary components of civilization, both gifts from Enki, both fundamental to the human condition, which tells you something about Sumerian realism, their willingness to acknowledge that civilization includes both creation and destruction, both love and war, both building and burning, and maybe we need that reminder. Maybe we need to remember that the same cultural technologies that allow us to create art and literature and complex societies also allow us to wage war and oppress people and destroy environments. It's all me, it's all gifts from Enki, it's all ambiguous, and sitting with that ambiguity, accepting it rather than trying to resolve it into some neat moral framework. Maybe that's maturity, maybe that's wisdom, maybe that's what allows sleep. Enki doesn't just possess the me, he actively distributes them, teaching humanity the arts of civilization, and the myths describe him traveling around establishing cities, organizing social systems, teaching crafts and technologies, essentially bootstrapping Sumerian civilization from scratch, which is obviously mythological exaggeration. Civilizations don't actually develop through divine instruction. They develop through gradual accumulation of knowledge and social experimentation and cultural evolution over long periods. But the myth captures something real about how it feels to learn, how it feels to suddenly understand something you didn't understand before, how knowledge can seem to come from outside, can seem like a gift, can transform your capabilities and your understanding of what's possible. And maybe that's what the Enki myths are really about. Not literal divine instruction, but the experience of cultural transmission, the way each generation receives knowledge from the previous generation and builds on it and passes it forward. The way civilization is fundamentally about accumulated learning, about standing on the shoulders of everyone who came before, about receiving gifts of knowledge that we didn't earn, that we got for free just by being born into a particular time and place and culture. And we should be grateful for these gifts, should recognize them as gifts, should honor the generations of humans who painstakingly figured out how to plant wheat and smelt copper and write symbols and organize cities and brew beer and all the other technologies we take for granted. They're all me, they're all divine powers in the sense that they elevate us above mere animal existence. They make us human in the fullest sense. They're what we pass on, what we contribute to, what we're here to maintain and develop and eventually transmit to the next generation, assuming there is a next generation, assuming we don't destroy ourselves first, which is a dark thought for a sleep video but also a very Sumerian thought, because the Sumerians understood that civilization is fragile, that the me can be lost or stolen or destroyed, that what took centuries to build can collapse in decades, and several of their myths deal with the theme of civilization's fragility, its dependence on divine favor and human effort, its vulnerability to cosmic and earthly threats. Here's a quirky interpretation that takes the me and runs with them in directions that would make academic Sumerologists clutch their clay tablets in horror. Some alternative researchers suggest that the me aren't abstract principles or cultural achievements, but rather actual physical objects, possibly advanced technological devices that Enki, understood as an extraterrestrial scientist rather than a god, brought to Earth and taught primitive humans to use. And in this interpretation, the myths about Enki distributing the me describe technology transfer from an advanced civilization to a less advanced one, and the specific me listed in the texts, things like lordship, godship, the exalted tiara, the throne of kingship, might refer to specific devices or tools that enabled social control and organization, maybe something like communication devices or computers or genetic modification equipment or other technologies so advanced they would seem magical to ancient people, who recorded their existence as divine powers. And while this interpretation requires you to read Sumerian mythology through a science fiction lens, to see myths as coded technical manuals, to translate every divine action into technological operation, and while mainstream scholars would be absolutely right to reject this as unsupported speculation that ignores how mythology actually works and what it actually does, I have to admit there's something entertaining about it. Something that appeals to the part of the brain that likes conspiracy theories and ancient mysteries and the idea that maybe, just maybe, the ancients knew more than we give them credit for, even if they didn't actually know it in the way these theories suggest. And thinking about Enki as an alien scientist teaching humans to use advanced technology is, I have to say, a pretty good distraction from whatever's keeping you awake. It's the kind of grand cosmic narrative that makes your immediate worries seem less pressing, less important, less worthy of sustained attention, which might be exactly what you need right now to let go and drift off. The scholarly debates around the me focus partly on their catalogue and classification, with scholars like Bent Alster and Jeremy Black publishing detailed studies of the me lists in different texts, analysing their structure and content and variation, arguing about whether certain me are more fundamental than others, whether we can reconstruct an original or authoritative list, whether the variations between texts reflect different theological traditions or simply scribal preferences, and these debates might seem obscure and overly specialized, the kind of academic minutiae that only specialists care about, but they actually matter because how you interpret the me affects how you understand Sumerian civilization, what they valued, how they organized their world, what they thought made society work, and the me give us direct access to Sumerian categories, to how they divided up the domain of culture and technology and social organization, and that's valuable, that's significant, that teaches us something about a very different way of conceptualizing civilization and comparing their categories to ours, seeing what they included that we might not, what they organized differently, what they emphasized. That comparative perspective is genuinely enriching, broadens our understanding of the possibilities of human social organization, reminds us that our current arrangements aren't natural or inevitable, but rather one possibility among many, one way of organizing the me among other ways, and maybe that perspective shift is valuable. Maybe it's liberating. Maybe it helps to know that kingship and warfare and property are me, are cultural technologies rather than natural facts, are things humans invented and therefore things humans could uninvent or reinvent or organize differently, though admittedly that's probably too much critical social theory for a sleep video, too much questioning of fundamental categories, too activating rather than sedating. So let me pull back, let me return to the gentle mythological narrative, to Enki traveling around ancient Sumer teaching humans how to be civilized. Let me paint that picture instead of analyzing its implications. Imagine Enki then. Imagine this god who's also a teacher, this divine being who takes particular interest in human welfare, traveling from city to city in earliest Sumer, stopping at Eridu and Ur and Uruk and Nippur and all the other cities that would become centers of civilization, and at each city he establishes institutions, teaches crafts, organizes worship, sets up the fundamental structures that will allow urban life to flourish, and the people receive these gifts with gratitude and awe. They build temples to honor him. They compose hymns praising his wisdom and generosity. They recognize that what they're receiving is precious beyond measure, is the difference between mere survival and true flourishing, between animal existence and human culture. And maybe we should have more of this, more recognition that we're constantly receiving gifts, that everything we know and can do came to us from others, that we're embedded in vast networks of knowledge transmission and cultural inheritance, that civilization isn't something we create individually, but something we participate in collectively, something we're given and something we give, something we receive and something we transmit. And when we forget this, when we imagine ourselves as self-made individuals who owe nothing to anyone, we're not just wrong, we're deeply wrong. We're forgetting the fundamental truth that the Enki myths remember, that civilization is gift, is grace, is unearned benefit that we should receive with humility and gratitude, not because gratitude is virtuous but because it's accurate. It corresponds to reality. We didn't earn this, we didn't make this, we got it for free, and the appropriate response is thank you. Thank you to the generations who came before. Thank you to the gods or the random processes of cultural evolution or whatever you think is responsible for the me we've inherited. Just thank you. And then sleep. Finally sleep, because gratitude is exhausting in its own way. Acknowledging debt is hard work. Recognizing dependence goes against the grain of modern individualism. So once you've done it, once you've felt it, you deserve rest. The myths about Enki and the me overlap with myths about Inanna, the goddess of love and war, who in some texts steals the me from Enki while he's drunk. which is a fantastic story that I should probably tell you about because it's genuinely entertaining and also deeply revealing about Sumerian attitudes toward gender and power and divine politics. The story goes that Inanna, ambitious goddess that she is, wants to increase the power and prestige of her city, Uruk, and she knows that Enki in his city of Eridu possesses the Mi, all of them, the whole collection of divine powers and civilizational fundamentals, and she decides she's going to acquire them, so she visits Enki, and he's so happy to see her, so charmed by her beauty and presence, that he throws a feast, and they drink beer, lots of beer. This is Sumer after all. Beer flows at divine banquets like water, and Enki gets progressively more drunk, and in his intoxicated generosity, he starts giving Inanna the Mi, one after another. You can have kingship, you can have priesthood, you can have warfare, and so on through the whole list. And Inanna accepts them all, loads them onto her boat, and sails away back to Uruk. And then Enki sobers up and realizes what he's done and sends messengers to stop her and retrieve the Mi. But Inanna outwits them all, gets the Mi safely to Uruk, and establishes her city as a major power, and Enki, despite being the wise god, the clever one, has to accept this outcome, has to acknowledge that Inanna fairly won the Mi through her own cleverness, and the story ends with the Mi distributed more widely, with Uruk sharing in the divine powers that were once concentrated in Eridu, which is probably a mythologized memory of real political shifts, real changes in the balance of power between Sumerian city-states. But it's also just a great story, a story about a goddess who drinks an older god under the table and steals the fundamentals of civilization, and there's something wonderfully human about it, wonderfully ordinary in its divine extraordinariness. Gods getting drunk and making decisions they regret, goddesses being clever and ambitious and successful, divine politics operating according to recognizably human patterns, and maybe that's comforting. Maybe it's good to know that even the gods screw up. Even divine wisdom has its limits. Even cosmic powers are subject to the consequences of drinking too much beer. We're not alone in our foolishness. The pattern goes all the way up. The mainstream scholarly interpretation of the Inanna and the Mi story focuses on its representation of gender dynamics and political competition. Scholars note that Inanna is unusual among ancient goddesses in combining both love and war aspects, both fertility and violence, both sexuality and power, and the story of her acquiring the Mi demonstrates her cleverness and agency, shows her successfully competing with a male god and winning, which some scholars read as reflecting real women's power in Sumerian society, while others see it as exceptional, as Inanna being the exception that proves the rule of male dominance. And there's ongoing debate about Sumerian gender relations, about the status of women in ancient Mesopotamia, about what the myths can tell us versus what they might obscure or idealize, and these are important questions that deserve serious scholarly attention, though they're probably too complicated to resolve in a sleep video, too politically fraught, too tangled up with contemporary gender politics and modern readers projecting their own issues onto ancient texts. So let me just note that the debate exists, that scholars disagree, that Sumerian gender dynamics were complex and probably inconsistent, varying by time period and social class and individual circumstances, like gender dynamics everywhere, and the myths give us glimpses of this complexity but not a complete picture. Fragments but not full understanding, which is fine, which is normal, which is all we ever get from ancient sources, fragments and glimpses and educated guesses, and we do our best with them. We tell our stories about what the stories mean, we create our interpretations and our theories, and maybe we're right, and maybe we're wrong, and probably we're both. Probably our interpretations capture something real, while also missing something essential. Probably truth is always partial, always incomplete, always subject to revision, which is either frustrating or liberating depending on your personality and current state of mind. And given that you're listening to this at whatever ungodly hour you're listening to this, probably you're too tired to care. Probably you just want the voice to continue, want the words to keep flowing, want the narrative to carry you along regardless of whether it's true or accurate or properly qualified with scholarly uncertainty. You just want to drift, and that's fine. Drift, let go, stop worrying about truth and accuracy, just listen, just breathe. Just let the story of Enki and Inanna wash over you like beer at a divine banquet, intoxicating and liberating and dissolving all your certainties, all your categories, all your need to know definitely whether this really happened or what it really means. just story, just voice, just the gentle rhythm of sentences carrying you down towards sleep. Everything we've discussed so far, all the creation and organization and distribution of civilization, all the careful work of the gods establishing cosmic order and human society, all of it is about to be destroyed because the Sumerian cosmos, like most ancient cosmologies, includes not just creation but also destruction, not just building up but also tearing down, not just order but also chaos reasserting itself. And the most famous Sumerian destruction myth is the flood, the great deluge that wipes out humanity, or almost all of humanity, preserving only one righteous man and his family. And if this sounds familiar, if you're thinking about Noah and his ark, well, yes, the biblical flood narrative is clearly related to earlier Mesopotamian flood myths. The Sumerians told this story first, or at least they wrote it down first. Their version predates Genesis by over 1,000 years, which doesn't necessarily mean the biblical version is copied from the Sumerian version, but does mean there's some kind of historical relationship, some shared cultural heritage, some common pool of ancient Near Eastern mythology from which both traditions drew, and scholars have extensively analyzed these relationships, compared the texts, mapped the similarities and differences, and the consensus is that yes, the biblical flood story shows knowledge of earlier Mesopotamian traditions, particularly the Babylonian Atrahasis epic and the Epic of Gilgamesh, both of which contain detailed flood narratives that share key elements with Genesis, the divine decision to destroy humanity, the selection of one righteous man to survive, the construction of a boat, the loading of animals, the sending of birds to check for dry land, the post-flood sacrifice. These motifs appear across the traditions, suggesting either direct literary influence or common sources, and this kind of textual comparison might seem dry and academic, but it's actually quite moving when you think about it. The way stories travel across cultures and centuries, the way narratives mutate and adapt while retaining their essential structure, the way the flood myth has been told and retold for millennia, each culture making it their own while preserving something of the original, something of the first storytellers who looked at geological evidence of ancient floods in Mesopotamia and created a cosmic narrative to explain it, to give it meaning, to wrestle with the theological implications of divine destruction and human survival. In the Sumerian version, the hero isn't called Noah but Ziusudra, and in the Akkadian versions he's Atrahasis or Utnapishtim. The names change, but the role remains constant. He's the one who survives, the one who preserves life through the catastrophe, and the reason for the flood varies depending on which text you read. Sometimes the gods are angry at human noise. We're too loud, we keep them awake, which is a wonderfully petty divine motivation. The gods deciding to wipe out humanity because we're noisy, because we disturb their rest. And there's something darkly comic about that, something that suggests the Sumerians understood that cosmic justice doesn't always make sense from a human perspective, that divine decisions might be arbitrary or disproportionate, or based on concerns that seem trivial to us. And maybe that's realistic. Maybe that corresponds to how disaster actually feels. Random, overwhelming, disconnected from any moral framework. Things fall apart not because we did something wrong, but just because they fall apart, because the universe is fundamentally indifferent to human welfare, because chaos is always waiting at the edges of order, because Namu's waters never fully retreated. They're still there, still threatening to rise up and reclaim everything. And maybe the flood myth is about this, about the precariousness of civilization, the fragility of the cosmic order that Enlil established, the constant possibility that it could all wash away, that we could lose everything, return to the undifferentiated waters, start over or not start over, just end. And contemplating this, sitting with this existential precariousness, maybe that's perversely calming, maybe recognizing that everything is temporary and fragile and could end at any moment actually reduces anxiety rather than increasing it, because once you accept the worst, once you acknowledge that yes, it could all fall apart, yes, the flood could come, yes, chaos could return, then you can stop worrying about preventing the inevitable and just appreciate what you have while you have it. Just exist in the moment without clinging to it. Just breathe and sleep and let tomorrow worry about itself. The decision to send the flood comes from the high gods, particularly Enlil, who's tired of humanity, tired of our noise or our wickedness or our reproduction rate depending on the text, and the other gods mostly agree. This is a collective decision, divine consensus that humanity needs to go, but Enki, clever Enki, compassionate Enki, Enki who created humans and taught us civilization and seems to genuinely care about us, Enki disagrees, but he can't directly oppose the decision of the divine council that would create divine civil war, would undermine the cosmic order, would be worse than the problem they're trying to solve. So instead, Enki does what Enki does best. He finds a loophole. He technically obeys the letter of divine law while violating its spirit. He's been forbidden to warn humans about the coming flood, so he doesn't warn humans. Instead, he goes to Ziusudra's house and speaks to the wall. He tells the wall all about the flood that's coming, describes in detail how Ziusudra should build a boat and load it with animals and his family and supplies. And of course, Ziusudra is inside the house listening through the wall, hearing everything Enki says. And he takes the warning and builds the boat. And Enki hasn't technically violated divine prohibition. He didn't speak to a human, he spoke to a wall. It's not his fault if a human happened to overhear. And this is such a perfectly Enki solution. So clever, so subversive, so committed to both letter and spirit of law, while completely undermining the law's intent. And it suggests something profound about the nature of civilization, about how progress often depends on creative rule-breaking, on finding loopholes, on technically obedient subversion, on people who care enough to preserve what matters even when official policy says let it all burn, or in this case let it all drown. We need the Enkis, we need the clever ones who find ways around destructive consensus, who preserve knowledge and life through catastrophe, who speak to walls when speaking to people is forbidden, who keep the me alive even when the gods decree their destruction. The mainstream scholarly interpretation of the flood myths emphasizes their reflection of real Mesopotamian environmental conditions. Scholars point out that the Tigris and Euphrates regularly flooded, sometimes catastrophically, destroying crops and settlements, and the collective memory of particularly severe floods probably underlies the mythological narrative of a universal deluge, the myths taking a real natural disaster and scaling it up to cosmic proportions, making it about divine will rather than hydrological patterns, and this interpretation is almost certainly at least partly correct. The flood myths do encode environmental knowledge, do preserve memories of actual disasters, do reflect the genuine precariousness of settlement in flood-prone river valleys, but they're also more than this. They're theological reflections on divine justice and human worth. They're narratives exploring what it means to survive when others don't, what obligations survivors have to the dead and to the future, what it means to preserve civilization through catastrophe. And these are questions that transcend their original environmental context, questions that remain relevant as long as humans face disasters and struggle to survive them, and wonder why some are saved while others perish. And the myths don't give easy answers, don't provide comfortable theodicy. Instead, they show divine disagreement, show gods arguing about whether humanity deserves to survive, show Enki subverting the divine consensus to save us not because we deserve it, but because he chooses to care about us. And maybe that's the best answer we're going to get. Maybe survival is ultimately about someone choosing to care, to preserve, to speak to the wall. Maybe there's no cosmic justice, only cosmic compassion. Maybe we're here not because we earned it, but because Enki liked us enough to break the rules. And you can find that comforting or disturbing or both, but either way it's a story, it's mythology. It's one way humans have tried to make sense of disaster and survival, and it's been told for over 4,000 years now, which suggests it captures something essential, something true in the way that myths are true, true to experience if not to history, true to feeling if not to fact. Now for the quirky interpretation that will make you either laugh or groan, or possibly both. Some alternative theorists suggest that the flood wasn't a natural disaster at all, but rather describes a deliberate act of genocide by the Anunnaki, the advanced beings who in this interpretation created humans as workers, and now decided their experiment had failed. The humans were too numerous, or too rebellious, or too noisy, and so they decided to eliminate the population and start over, and they used some kind of weapon or technology to trigger massive flooding, maybe manipulating weather patterns or melting ice caps or causing seismic events that generated tsunamis, and Enki, who in this interpretation is the leader of a faction of Anunnaki who opposed this genocide, warned Ziusudra not through divine speech but through technological communication, maybe a radio or other device hidden in his house, and helped him build not just a boat but possibly some kind of submarine or survival module equipped with advanced life support, and the whole narrative is a mythologized memory of this ancient technological catastrophe, preserved in the only language available to ancient people, the language of gods and divine decrees and supernatural interventions. This interpretation requires, as always, reading mythology as encoded history and science, translating gods into aliens and divine powers into technology and supernatural events into natural or technological ones, and mainstream scholars would be absolutely right to dismiss this as baseless speculation that ignores how mythology actually functions and what evidence actually supports. But I include it because it demonstrates how adaptable these myths are, how they can be retold in completely different idioms, how the essential narrative structure, righteous man warned of coming destruction builds, boat saves life, preserves civilization, can survive radical reinterpretation, can work in ancient theological frameworks and modern science fiction frameworks equally well, which suggests something about the power of narrative, the way certain story structures resonate across wildly different contexts and worldviews, the way we keep telling the same stories while thinking we're telling new ones, and maybe recognizing this, seeing the pattern repeat, helps us understand ourselves better, helps us see that we're part of continuity that extends back thousands of years and will extend forward who knows how far, helps us feel connected to the ancient Sumerians and the biblical authors and all the other people who've told flood stories, helps us recognize our common humanity across vast chasms of time and culture, and maybe that recognition is itself a kind of comfort. A kind of lullaby. You're not alone. You're part of this long chain of humans trying to make sense of disaster, trying to survive, trying to preserve what matters, trying to sleep. The scholarly debates around the flood myths get into questions about the relationship between different versions, the Sumerian Ziusudra tradition versus the Akkadian Atrahasis and Gilgamesh traditions versus the biblical Noah tradition, and scholars have produced elaborate stemmas and charts showing possible lines of textual influence and tradition development, and they argue about whether there was an original flood myth that all the versions derive from, or whether the similarities reflect convergent mythological development or common environmental experiences, and these debates might seem academic in the worst sense, overly technical, disconnected from what actually matters, but they're attempts to understand how stories travel and change, how oral tradition becomes written text, how mythology preserves and transforms across generations, and that's important work, that matters, that helps us understand not just ancient Mesopotamia but human culture generally, how we transmit meaning, how we preserve knowledge, how we adapt old stories for new contexts, and the fact that we're still arguing about these texts 4,000 years after they were written suggests they got something right, preserved something worth preserving, created stories that transcend their original context and continue to speak to human concerns, human fears, human hopes, human needs, including the need to sleep, the need to rest, the need to stop thinking about floods and catastrophes and divine decisions and just float, just drift, just let the waters carry you not to destruction but to dreams. Ziusudra builds his boat according to Enki's specifications, and the texts give detailed dimensions and construction techniques, and scholars have actually tried to determine whether a boat built to these specifications would actually float, would actually be seaworthy, and the answer is maybe. It depends on how you interpret the measurements and what materials you assume were used, but the point isn't whether the boat could actually work, the point is the preservation, the careful attention to saving life, to loading the boat with animals and seeds and family and everything needed to restart civilization after the waters recede. And this image, this ark floating on endless water carrying everything precious, everything worth saving, this image has incredible emotional and symbolic power. It's been painted and sung about and retold countless times. It's become one of the foundational images of Western culture. And it starts here, starts in Sumer, starts with Ziusudra and Enki. and the decision to preserve rather than destroy, to save rather than abandon, to care enough about the future to build a boat even when everything suggests there's no future worth building for. And maybe that's the real message of the flood myths, not divine judgment or cosmic justice, but human persistence, human hope, human refusal to give up even when the gods decree destruction, human commitment to preservation, to continuation, to tomorrow. And if you're lying there unable to sleep because you're worried about tomorrow, about the floods in your own life, about the chaos threatening to overwhelm you, maybe the flood myth offers some comfort, reminds you that others have faced catastrophe before, have survived, have preserved what mattered, have built boats and floated through the deluge and landed on dry ground eventually. And you can too. You can survive your floods. You can preserve what matters. You can build your boat from whatever materials you have available. And you can rest now. You can stop building for a few hours. You can trust that the boat will hold, that the waters will recede, that dry land exists somewhere ahead, even if you can't see it yet. You can sleep. The flood comes, the rains fall, the waters rise, covering everything, drowning everyone except those on the boat, and the destruction is total, comprehensive, the end of a world, and the myths describe divine regret, the gods realizing maybe they've made a mistake, maybe destroying humanity wasn't such a good idea, particularly because with no humans, there's no one to make sacrifices, no one to feed the gods, and the gods get hungry, which is a wonderfully humanizing detail. Gods dependent on human worship for their sustenance, gods who need us as much as we need them, gods who make decisions in anger and regret them when the consequences become clear, and when the flood finally recedes and Ziusudra offers sacrifice, the gods smell it and gather around like people at a barbecue, like they haven't eaten in months, which they haven't, and they realize they need humanity, need us to worship them, to feed them, to maintain the relationship, and they vow never to send another flood, never to destroy humanity completely. And this vow, this promise, becomes the foundation for the restored relationship between gods and humans, a new covenant, a recognition of mutual dependence. And maybe that's the deepest truth the flood myths offer, not that we're servants of indifferent gods, but that we're partners with gods who need us, who depend on us, who can't maintain cosmic order without our participation, who need our work and our worship and our presence. And this mutual need creates obligation, both ways, creates responsibility, creates relationship, and relationship, even difficult relationship, even relationship marked by destruction and survival and regret, is better than isolation, is better than abandonment, is what makes existence bearable, is what makes tomorrow worth surviving for, is what lets you sleep, knowing you're not alone, knowing you're part of something larger, knowing that even if the floods come, you're connected to others, to the gods, or to humanity, or to the long chain of survivors who've built boats and preserved life and started over, and you can start over too. You can wake tomorrow and begin again, but first you have to sleep, have to let this day end, have to release your grip on consciousness and drift down into the dark waters of sleep, trusting they'll hold you, trusting you'll surface again when morning comes, trusting the flood won't last forever, trusting Enki's still speaking to walls, still preserving what matters, still subverting divine decrees for the sake of life, still on your side even when everything else seems against you. So sleep, please sleep, let the waters rise, let them cover everything, let yourself sink below the surface, let go. We've traveled together through the oldest stories humans ever wrote down, through myths that were already ancient when the pyramids were built, through narratives that have shaped 3,000 years of subsequent Western mythology and theology, and now we find ourselves here, at the end of this particular telling, at the edge of sleep if we're lucky, at the boundary between waking and dreaming, between the ancient Sumerian cosmos and your very modern bedroom, and it's time to gather the threads, to reflect on what we've encountered, to let the images and ideas settle into whatever patterns they want to form in your consciousness as it ebbs towards sleep, to acknowledge what we've done here tonight, which is something strange and perhaps impossible, trying to use 4,000-year-old Mesopotamian mythology as a lullaby, trying to find in the Sumerian understanding of creation and destruction and human purpose something that speaks to contemporary insomnia, something that eases the transition from waking anxiety to sleeping peace, And whether this has worked for you, whether you're actually drowsy now, or whether you've been awake this whole time fighting the narrative voice, either outcome is fine. Either way, you've spent time with these ancient stories. You've let them into your consciousness. You've made space for Namu and Enlil and Enki and all the other gods with their cosmic dramas and their all-too-human concerns. And maybe something has shifted. Maybe some small pattern in your thinking has changed. Maybe you see creation a little differently now. See yourself a little differently. See the relationship between order and chaos, between construction and destruction, between work and rest, in a new light. The Sumerians, those practical poets who invented writing to track grain deliveries and ended up preserving cosmological visions that would outlast their entire civilization, who built their cities from mud and reeds and nevertheless created culture that would influence every subsequent Near Eastern society, who saw themselves as cosmic servants created from clay and divine blood and nevertheless found meaning and beauty and purpose in their existence, who experienced catastrophic floods and nevertheless chose to preserve, to continue, to build boats and start over. These people, our distant ancestors in culture if not always in blood, understood something we keep forgetting, understood that stories matter, that narrative shapes reality, that the myths we tell ourselves determine how we experience existence, and they created myths that acknowledged darkness and chaos and divine caprice while still affirming the value of life, the importance of work, the necessity of civilization, the possibility of preservation. And these aren't simple affirmations, aren't naive optimism, they're hard-won insights from a people who knew suffering, who knew precariousness, who knew that the waters could rise at any time and wash everything away, and nevertheless they chose to tell stories about gods who cared enough to speak to walls, about humans clever enough to build boats, about survival and continuation and the stubborn persistence of life despite everything arrayed against it. And maybe we need these stories now, maybe we need the Sumerian vision of reality as fundamentally unstable but also fundamentally resilient, as constantly threatened by chaos but also constantly renewed by effort and care and divine intervention. However you want to understand divine intervention, whether as actual supernatural agency or as the better angels of our nature or as random chance or as anything else, the label matters less than the pattern, the recognition that preservation is possible, that starting over is possible, that tomorrow is possible even when today seems impossible. The water we began with, Namu's primordial ocean, the undifferentiated sea that held all possibility before creation began, this water never went away. It's still there in Sumerian cosmology, still surrounding the created world, still threatening to break through the boundaries that hold it back, still waiting to reclaim everything. And this is important. This isn't just background detail. This is central to the Sumerian understanding of reality, that creation is temporary, that order is provisional, that chaos is the default state and cosmos is the exception, and maintaining cosmos requires constant work, constant vigilance, constant divine and human effort. And maybe this seems pessimistic. Maybe you want a more secure foundation for reality than this. Maybe you want guarantees that the center will hold, that things won't fall apart, that the waters won't rise. But the Sumerians didn't offer guarantees, didn't promise security, didn't pretend that order was permanent or natural or anything other than hard-won and precarious and dependent on continued effort. And maybe this honesty is itself valuable. Maybe acknowledging precariousness is healthier than denying it. Maybe recognizing that yes, the waters could rise, yes, everything could fall apart, yes, chaos waits at the edges. Maybe this recognition allows you to stop clutching so tightly to control, stop exhausting yourself trying to prevent the inevitable, stop lying awake worrying about whether the center will hold, and instead just do what you can do. Build your boat, preserve what matters, work tomorrow and rest tonight. Accept that you can't control the cosmos, can't prevent the floods, can't guarantee continuation, but you can care, you can try. You can participate in the great work of preservation, even knowing it might fail, even knowing it probably will fail eventually, even knowing that everything built will someday wash away. You can still build, still care, still try, and then you can sleep, you can let go, you can trust that the waters will hold you rather than drown you, at least for tonight, at least for these hours of darkness. The gods we've encountered, with their hierarchies and their disputes and their contradictory decrees, with their dependence on human worship and their capacity for both preservation and destruction, With their cosmic powers and their petty grievances, these gods offer a vision of divinity that's simultaneously exalted and mundane, transcendent and immanent, perfect and flawed, and maybe this mixed vision is more helpful than either pure transcendence or pure immanence alone. Maybe we need gods who are both beyond us and like us, who operate on cosmic scales but also experience hunger and anger and compassion, who can both decree floods and speak to walls, who embody both law and its subversion, both order and chaos, both creation and destruction, because reality itself is mixed, is contradictory, is simultaneously meaningful and meaningless, beautiful and terrible, worth preserving and inevitably lost. And the Sumerian gods, for all their strangeness, for all the cultural distance between their Bronze Age Mesopotamian context and our contemporary one, these gods still work as symbols of these contradictions, still help us think about the fundamental ambiguities of existence, still give us images and narratives for wrestling with questions that have no answers, questions about purpose and suffering and survival and value, questions that keep us awake at night when we should be sleeping, and maybe spending time with these gods, letting them into our imagination, recognizing them as projections of human concerns onto cosmic screens. Maybe this helps. Maybe this provides some framework for thinking about things that resist thinking, some story for experiencing things that resist story, some mythology for the fundamentally mythological nature of human consciousness trying to understand itself and its place in an ultimately incomprehensible universe. The clay tablets that preserved these myths, brittle ceramic artifacts inscribed with wedge-shaped marks that took scholars over a century to fully decipher, these tablets are miracles of preservation. Think about it. Soft clay pressed with a reed stylus, dried in the sun or baked in a kiln, buried in the ruins of ancient cities, surviving fire and flood and millennia of neglect, waiting in darkness to be discovered, excavated, translated, shared, and now these ancient words have traveled from Sumerian temples to your ears or eyes, from clay to pixels to neurons, crossing vast distances of space and time and culture, and you're receiving them here in your bed, in whatever year you're experiencing. You're the end point of this long chain of preservation and transmission. You're the reason, in some sense, that Sumerian priests composed these myths and scribes recorded them and tablets survived and archaeologists excavated them and scholars translated them and I'm narrating them. And you're receiving them. This whole elaborate process of cultural transmission exists so that you, specifically you, can lie here tonight thinking about primordial waters and cosmic separation and clay bodies and divine blood and boats floating on endless floods. And maybe that seems absurd. Maybe it seems grandiose to think these ancient myths could be meant for you. But why not? Why shouldn't they be for you? You're human. You're part of the same species that created these stories. You're asking the same questions they asked, wondering about the same mysteries, experiencing the same fundamental confusion about why there's something rather than nothing, why consciousness exists, why we're here, what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to survive. And the myths don't answer these questions, but they hold space for them, they acknowledge them. They say, yes, we've wondered too, we've struggled too, we've tried to make sense of this too, and this is what we came up with. These stories, these images, these gods, and they might help you or they might not, but at least you're not alone in your questioning, at least you're part of a tradition of wondering that extends back to the very beginning of recorded thought. Human creation from clay and divine blood, this image we spent time with in section 3, this combination of earth and heaven, matter and spirit, this captures something essential about embodied consciousness, about what it feels like to be a mind in a body, to be awareness embedded in flesh, to be thoughts arising from neurons, arising from atoms, arising from who knows what, from quantum fields or primordial waters or divine intention or random chance. We don't know, can't know. The origin of consciousness remains mysterious despite all our neuroscience and philosophy and theology, remains as mysterious now as it was to the Sumerians who said we're clay and godblood, which is poetry, which is metaphor, which is myth, but which is also somehow more honest than scientific reduction, more comprehensive than materialist explanation, because it acknowledges both poles, both the sheer materiality of existence, the way we're made of ordinary stuff, dirt and water and carbon, and also the extraordinary fact of consciousness, the way we're aware, the way we experience, the way we're here in some ineffable sense that transcends mere physical description, and holding both truths, being both clay and divine blood. Maybe that's what being human is. Maybe that's what these myths understood. Maybe that's what they're trying to tell us across 4 millennia of cultural transformation. You're both. You're matter and meaning. You're body and consciousness. You're the cosmic contradiction. And it's okay. It's okay to be both. It's okay to not resolve into one pole or the other. It's okay to remain in the tension, in the mixture, in the clay and blood existence that the Sumerians described and you're experiencing right now in your body, in your bed, in this moment. The flood and preservation, Ziusudra and his boat, Enki speaking to walls. This narrative about destruction survived and civilization preserved. This story has obvious resonance for anyone who's experienced loss, who's lived through disaster, who's had to start over, who's had to build a boat from whatever was available and load it with whatever seemed worth saving and float through waters that seemed endless. And maybe you're in those waters now. Maybe that's why you can't sleep. Maybe you're floating through your own personal flood, wondering if there's dry land ahead or if it's just water forever, and the myth can't promise you dry land, can't guarantee survival, can't assure you that everything will work out. But it can remind you that others have floated too, have survived, have landed eventually, have started over, have built new cities and planted new crops and told new stories. It can remind you that Enki's still speaking to walls, still finding loopholes in destructive decrees, still working to preserve what matters even when official policy says, let it all drown. And maybe you can be Enki for yourself. Maybe you can speak to your own walls. Maybe you can find creative solutions to impossible problems. Maybe you can preserve what needs preserving, even when everything suggests giving up. Or maybe you just need to be Ziusudra, need to hear the warning, need to build the boat, need to trust that someone cares enough to help you survive. And either way, either as the clever god or the faithful human, you're part of this story, you're enacting this myth, you're living this pattern that's been lived countless times before and will be lived countless times after, and there's comfort in that, in being part of a pattern, in knowing your struggles aren't unique, aren't isolated, aren't unprecedented. Others have been here before, in these waters, in this darkness, and they survived, mostly, some of them, enough of them to keep the story going, to pass it forward, to let it reach you here tonight. The me, those divine powers and civilizational fundamentals that Enki distributed and Inanna stole, those technologies and principles and practices that make culture possible, you have access to them, you're soaking in them, you're surrounded by accumulated me from generations of humans who came before. You can read because someone invented writing. You can listen because someone invented recording technology. You're lying on a manufactured mattress in a constructed building using devices that would seem magical to the Sumerians. You have me they never imagined, and they had me that we've lost, and the collection changes, evolves, adapts. Some me preserved, some me forgotten, some me invented, some me stolen. And all of it together makes civilization, makes culture, makes the elaborate web of technologies and practices and knowledge that we swim in without noticing, that we take for granted the way fish take water for granted, and maybe pausing to recognize this, to feel gratitude for the me you've inherited, to acknowledge that everything you know and can do came from others, from the long chain of humans trying and failing and trying again, from the Enkis distributing knowledge and the Inannas stealing it and redistributing it, from all the speakers to walls who preserved what mattered through catastrophe. Maybe this recognition helps. Maybe gratitude eases anxiety. Maybe acknowledging dependence reduces the burden of independence. Maybe remembering you're part of something larger lets you relax your individual grip on control, lets you trust the collective, trust the tradition, trust that the me will persist even if you personally fail, trust that your small contribution to preservation matters even if you can't see how, trust and sleep, finally sleep. The myths end, but the cosmos continues. The stories we've told tonight are finished, but the Sumerian universe keeps operating according to the principles established at creation. Namu's waters still surround everything, and still rules heaven from his distant palace. Enlil still maintains cosmic law. Enki still speaks to walls when necessary. The me still circulate through culture. Humans still work and worship and wonder about their purpose. The pattern persists. The mythology remains active, remains relevant, remains capable of speaking to contemporary concerns despite its ancient origin. And maybe this is what myths do. Maybe this is their function, not to provide literal truth, but to offer patterns that transcend their specific historical context, narratives that capture something essential about human experience regardless of when or where that experience occurs. And the Sumerian myths do this. They work, they speak, they resonate, they help. At least they might help. At least they've helped me, and I hope they're helping you. Helping you relax, helping you let go of whatever you're clutching, helping you drift towards sleep, which is the ultimate goal here. The reason for this entire exercise, this extended meditation on ancient Mesopotamian cosmology, this journey through waters and separation and clay bodies and divine blood and floods and boats and walls and me and all the rest of it. All of it in service of helping you sleep, helping you rest, helping you release consciousness for a few hours and sink into whatever dreams await you in the darkness behind your closing eyes. So here we are, at the genuine end now, at the place where I stop talking and you stop listening, where the voice fades and silence returns, where the myths recede back into clay tablets and academic journals and cultural memory while you descend into sleep, into your own primordial waters, into the undifferentiated darkness that Namu represents, into the space before thought, before category, before separation, before all the distinctions that make waking life so complicated and exhausting. You're returning to unity, to wholeness, to the cosmic mountain before Enlil split it apart, and you can stay there as long as you need, can float in those waters until morning calls you back to separation, back to individual consciousness, back to being clay and divine blood instead of just water. But for now, for these hours, you can let all that go, can release the burden of being you, can dissolve into sleep, can trust that you'll reform when needed. But right now you can just be water, just be darkness, just be the gentle rhythm of breathing that continues whether you pay attention to it or not. And if you've enjoyed this journey through Sumerian mythology, if this has helped even slightly with your sleep, consider subscribing to the channel. Consider supporting this strange project of using ancient stories as modern lullabies. Consider leaving a comment about where you are and how this helped or didn't help. Consider being part of this small community of people who find comfort in Bronze Age cosmology and gentle sarcasm and the slow accumulation of historical detail delivered in soothing tones. But don't worry about any of that now. Don't let thoughts of subscribing or commenting keep you awake. You can do all that tomorrow. Right now you need to sleep, need to rest, need to let the Sumerian cosmos fade into dream, need to become water yourself, need to float, need to sink, need to let go. So let go. Please let go. The gods are watching over you. Enki's speaking to your walls. Namu's waters are holding you. The boat is sound. The flood will recede. Dry land exists ahead. But first sleep, now sleep, finally sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.